components into each of the sections and load those to the Pacific Power website. For those of you joining us that need Spanish or American Sign Language interpretation, you can navigate to interpretation at the bottom of your Zoom window and select ASL under Watch or Spanish under Audio. If the interpretation icon is missing, you can usually resolve that by clicking the 3 dots More icon. If we do end up in a group discussion at any point during today's conversation, please use the gallery view. It'll make it easier for folks to participate. And then if you have any technical support needs, please chat our technical support resource on the line tag as the recipient sends your message, and he'll work one-on-one with you to resolve the issue. I also want to note that questions are welcome at any time through today's conversation, but please use the raise hand icon so that we know that you're looking to speak, and please remain muted until you are speaking. And with that, I want to turn over to our agenda. So this morning, we're going to start by reviewing our purposes and objectives. Then we'll pass this over to talk about the CEIP, or Clean Energy Implementation Plan. We'll have some updates for the biennial status. We'll talk about integrated resource planning. We'll take a 10-minute break and then come back for distribution system planning. And then we'll talk about the 2024 engagement spaces. I'm going to pause for just a moment here, just to make sure that folks are digesting and have connected to the correct channel, since I see on my screen there are some folks still connecting. Okay, now let's jump to the next slide, please, Morgan. So the engagement series purpose for the Clean Energy Implementation Plan is to provide an integrated lens on clean energy planning with expanded learning opportunities to foster a deeper understanding of programs and outreach while making sure that we are gathering public input throughout the process. So today's objectives are to socialize the Clean Energy Implementation Plan, provide updates on the Pacific Power Integrated Resource Plan, or IRP, and then share distribution system planning background. Let's jump to the next slide, please, Morgan. And to accomplish that task, we've got a great set of folks from Pacific Power that are going to be leading specific conversations. So we have Stephanie, who is the regulatory manager, and Matthew McPhee, also from the regulatory group. Then we have Randy, who is the director of resource planning, and Ian, who is the distribution system planning manager. All of these folks are here. We'll layer in their expertise, and we'll take questions from folks throughout their section. And if there's a question that somebody presents that we don't have the right expertise on the line for, what we'll do is we'll take a note, put it in a parking lot, and we'll try to circle up during the call to see if we can get an answer. And if not, we'll follow up with you directly one-on-one after the meeting. So with that, I want to invite to the virtual stage our Stephanie Meeks to talk about the Clean Energy Implementation Plan and its related milestones. Stephanie?
Thank you, Jeffrey. I'm happy to be here with everybody today. Thank you for your time. We definitely appreciate it. First off, we wanted to talk about, our Clean Energy Implementation Plan as we are, jumping into the 2025 CEIP. And so we're looking at that planning element right now. We wanted to bring this forward and have the conversation up front. Then we'll pass it over, as Jeffrey said, over to Matt to provide some information on where we're at with the CEIP biennial update, with where we're at with that one. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll walk right through. So this slide was really to show an illustration of our targets that we need to be reaching for CETA with our CEIPs that we're going forward, that we're looking at with the 2025 elimination of coal from Washington rates. We have the greenhouse gas neutral in 2030 for serving Washington. And then in 2045, carbon free for serving retail in Washington. So these are our targets that we are definitely reaching forward towards. And as we do that, the process that we have is we file our CEIPs that are covering a 4-year focus period on our interim targets and our actions that we've been doing while looking at those long-term targets that we need to be reaching for. So this one was really just showing an illustration of, that information of what we're doing. Each one has a 4-year period that we cover with a biannual update within the middle of it, providing some update on the information as we learn more, as we go through the process. Things change. We see things of new technologies and stuff coming up. So as that happens, we bring those updates into our planning process, as well as we have progress reports that happen throughout each year. First one was starting in July of 2023. And so we'll have our next one coming up in July of this year. So where we're at right now, as you look in these areas up at the front, we have filed our first CEIP. That one has been approved by a multi-party settlement. We do have some conditions on that we agreed upon, and so we'll be going over those in an additional slide coming up. And we have filed our CEIP biannual update. That would be that one that's right in between there that we filed in 2023 in November. Again, Matt will cover where we're at with that one. And so now where we're at and why we wanted to bring this information forward again and have these conversations in such this meeting space that we're having today is to talk about that 2025 CEIP, where we're going to be looking at that 2026 to 2029 period. And each of the areas, below we have listed of the focus of what those CEIPs will cover. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So as we go through this process of updating our, producing our 2025 CEIP, it really came relevant to go back and look and see what we had done with the first initial one. And a lot of the information still stands relevant and something that we need to go back and reflect on and incorporate those elements into it with just some minor refinements, but there's still some areas where we're still working on these. So as such as named communities, we do have our vulnerable populations that we're going to be hosting workshops this year. So we're going to be looking at how we're identifying those and making sure those are still a correct interpretation of what we're going to be showing. We're going to review our CBIs as well as update those for also settlement agreement conditions that we have. So as we're working on that too as well, that'll get incorporated into this. Making sure we're staying with our regulatory alignment with anything that we have going on in any of our orders that we have received. So we want to make sure that we're staying right in sync with what we need to be incorporating into this. As well as Brandy will be talking about too as well. We do have our integrated resource plan that'll go into the 2025 CEIP. So Brandy's team is working towards that, hosting public input meetings as well on that integrated resource plan that'll get incorporated into the 2025 clean energy implementation plan. And so while that is going to be filed in early 2025, then by October 1st of 2025, we'll be filing our CEIP. Again, covering that period of 2026 with a focus to 2029. With that, let's go ahead and move forward to the next one. So when we're looking again at our 2025 CEIP, we have some categorizations that we've put in for our actions that we utilized in our first initial CEIP that we still feel are relevant, where we're looking at our supply side resources. So we're looking at that new generation, the elements that that integrated resource plan will be bringing forth into the process. We have energy efficiency. That is, a combination of programs that we already have in place and looking at anything that we might have expanding in the horizon that we'd be bringing forward. We have our demand response, which is our programs and actions that we are working towards of having customers being able to provide some great support from things that we could offer in conjunction with them of a reduction to electric consumption at times when it's most expensive. So that a way of offsetting demand on the system. And then as we do this process in our 2025 CEIP, we'll do things such as we're doing today and having some community outreach and engagement where we want to make sure we're providing information on the direction that we're going and seek some feedback and input from others that are on here. We also do offer our advisory groups too as well. So those are also elements we have where we have people that can also engage in those spaces too. So the next slide, please. So as we approach our 2025 CEIP, I just wanted to bring up just a general, just this is some key areas of our 2021 CEIP settlement conditions from our approved settlement. These aren't all of the conditions. This is just a collection of some of them and some of the key areas. Definitely customer benefit indicators is an area that, we have a lot of information that we're looking closely at, how we're tracking there. So we'll be tracking and reporting that information on. As I mentioned before, we'll be looking to update and possibly revise any CBIs as we're bringing forward those that have come through from settlement that we've also agreed upon. And just having that information readily available in the reporting forms of our reporting out, such as our 2024 CEIP progress report. Some of the elements into the integrated resource plan will be us providing that update as we did in our 2023 CEIP biannual update for our interim targets. We also provide that we will participate in future discussions of the incremental cost calculations, because that's an important area that we need to all be, staying aware of. And then just some other elements of the integrated resource plan. I'm not going to read through all of these. These are just, to reflect back on some high level of them. Other conditions we have, are again, our engagement, our outreach, inclusion of the advisory groups, such as this meeting today. We reached out to our advisory group members so we could have a collective group here for this call today, as well as recording it. So then it's also available for people to come back and reflect on the information, follow up back with us too, with anything that they might have some input on that they would like to share. We do also come through and have meetings in the advisory groups where we're bringing them updates on things that are going on with the CEIP. But this space brings everyone together. And it was, again, one of our settlement conditions we agreed upon. The next one I wanted to touch on this one was our distribution system planning, that we'd be soliciting interested parties' input on the options and strategies that we'd be looking at in Washington. So Ian's going to be here today to discuss some of that, which will be really great to start getting that series kicked off. We're planning on having it be incorporated into these meetings going forward for this year and see how far that extends out. So we're excited to hear this beginning for Ian on our engagement with the CEIP too as well in Washington. So with that, I think we go to the next slide. And now I will turn it over to Matt McVie to provide us a status update on our CEIP biannual update.
Good morning. As Stephanie said, my name is Matt McVie. I'm Vice President of Regulatory Policy for Pacificorp. And so if we could go to the next slide, I'll discuss our biennial update to the CEIP, the Clean Energy Implementation Plan for Washington that we filed last November. So the main thing that I wanted to highlight here is that we believed we had to reduce some of our targets in the biennial update. We had raised this and discussed this with parties before filing. This was one of the conditions that in the stipulation for our original CEIP was a condition that we will update the targets in the biennial update. And that was due to a number of conditions kind of occurring all at once. And so I wanted to just kind of walk through the reason why, and then if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer those. The first one relates to our allocation methodology. Now, it gets a little complicated, so I'd like to skip over that and then come back to it. But essentially, the allocation methodology is how we spread the costs that we incur to serve all of our customers across all of our states. And so I can talk about that a little bit more in depth. But what it is it's a methodology. It's a series of formulas to essentially distribute the cost that is approved by each one of our commissioners or each one of our regulatory commissions in each one of our states. I think some of the other issues that occurred was a significant repricing of the bids in our 2020 request for proposal. So we were looking for renewable resources back in 2020. That 2020 is the year that we issued our request for proposals. Due to COVID, due to supply chain issues, what we got is after we started to select the short list of resources. So these were going to be power purchase agreements where we're going to engage and get energy from various renewable resources. We started getting new price bids from those developers, and they have the right to come in and say, we need to reprice. We can no longer provide energy at the cost that we originally proposed. We had to look at all of those. And at the time, we were getting ready to issue another RFP. We're coming in with a new IRP. And so one of the obligations as a utility is that we are always prudent in our judgment, which means we have to analyze everything, the economics, the benefits for our customers. And it got to the point where we just weren't sure. Could we justify a new cost for a resource? We didn't have any market data, and there was a lot of things that were in flux just because of everything that was going on with supply chain, with COVID, workforce issues. So that ended up pushing us back a little bit. We weren't able to procure the resources in 2020 because we didn't know if we would be able to support those going forward. The rate impacts of continuing high energy market prices has also kind of occurred. I mean, between a lot of it is the high gas price. The high gas price is impacted by world events, but that has driven up the cost of energy. And originally, our plan was to replace. We would remove the energy provided from two of our coal resources that serve Washington customers in 24 and 25. But we did have some flexibility depending on what the circumstances were. And, fortunately, we did. We included that flexibility because what we found was that by continuing to use those resources to serve Washington customers for 2 years, we were saving something on the order of $70 million a year for our customers. And so we still got to remove those resources from service at the end of 2025 in compliance with CETA. They will not be used to serve Washington customers starting in 2026. But we're able to save customers a significant amount of money while the market prices are high. Now we're starting to see those market prices level out, and hopefully they will start to decline. And then that allows us that ability to not impact rates as much going forward. And then there's also competition for short-term contracts. One of the things that we contemplated, and we know that other utilities were looking at the same thing, is this idea of, well, we can set the targets and then we could buy RECs. We could buy short-term renewable resources. But the true compliance period is 2030. And so we as a utility, we weren't kind of looking at this as, okay, we set a standard, we're going to meet it at all costs. Buying RECs just to meet a compliance requirement, versus starting to move towards that long-term compliance starting at 2030, where you've got, actual resources or long-term power purchase agreements. We didn't think that was beneficial. For our customers, for the company, it didn't seem like the best approach. And so revising the targets down to allow us to then keep moving towards 2030, but not costing customers, not increasing rates for our customers unnecessarily. So that was essentially the position that we took. Now, stepping back to the allocation methodology, we had, and sorry, I work with rates all the time. I work with regulatory policy. So I can get technical really quick, and I will try not to, but we have an agreement that sets forth a series of cost allocation formulas. So every cost that we incur gets spread to customers in each one of our states. And some of them are only paid by customers in the states. Distribution system costs, the vast majority of those, absent, say, software that runs all of our systems. But all of those lines that go to individual homes, individual businesses, those are paid for by customers in that particular state. But our transmission system that crosses state lines, that's going to be shared by customers in all of our states. And so we have these formulas that kind of share those costs, and we file that methodology, and it's approved by each one of the regulatory commissions. Now, we've had these allocation methodologies. They've been in place since PacifiCorp became a multi-state utility sometime in the 1960s or 70s. And as we've changed, as we've added Utah, they've become a little bit more detailed, therefore a little bit more complex, but we've had more experience, and so have all of the parties that intervene and participate in our rate making process. Well, in the last methodology we had that we got approved in 2019, and it started in 2020, we had that was developed in response to Oregon's Senate Bill 1547, which addressed removal of coal. And then as we were finalizing, Washington passed the Clean Energy Transformation Act. And so we were able to start integrating, trying to address those issues so that we could still keep our costs as low as possible, but also be fair to all of the states. And so we were looking at how to do that transition. We reached an agreement that would essentially kind of address new generation would go to states with an identified need, and that need would include new energy policy. Now, after we signed the 2020 protocol, after we got approved in all the states, including Washington, then we've got a whole new set of legislation, and we've got the new market prices started to increase. Essentially, you can't predict the future, and a lot of things started to change. That new energy policy in Oregon with House Bill 2021, and then what's more recently, we're getting new legislation in Utah, and there's some newer legislation in Wyoming. And so the parties that were part of those negotiations on what that new allocation methodology would be wanted to explore additional options. And so we didn't move to the next step as we anticipated. Originally, we anticipated there would be a new methodology in 24 and 25, which would mean more of those resources, the new resources added to the system, would go to Washington. But we didn't get that. We have parties from Washington in those negotiations, and the consensus decision was to look at some other options. And so we've pushed that out. We've extended the approved allocation methodology in all of those states that we needed to get a formal extension, and everyone has agreed that that was necessary. And so essentially that was one of the more complicated, kind of wonky rate making issues that we've had to deal with that has led to that decrease from our original filing. So apologize for getting too detailed in rate making for those that are not familiar with it, but just wanted to give a little bit of background there. If we go to the next slide. So just wanted to talk a little bit about the status. So the original CEIP we filed at the end of 2021. We reached a multi-party settlement at kind of late summer, early autumn of 2023. And then we got approval of that settlement in October. We immediately filed the biennial update in response. I've gone through kind of the reasons for that, but we've updated several things. Mostly it was the interim targets. We had some updates to the CPIs, some updates to the public engagement process, and then we revised the incremental cost analysis. Now, all of the commission, the Washington Commission, considered all of the biennial updates from each one of the 3 electric utilities in Washington on March 22, and ours was set for adjudication. Staff had essentially, we had a couple discussions with staff. We were trying to resolve some of the issues. There was some conditions that the utility we couldn't agree to as a utility. And we don't think the commission could approve legally as under the statutes. And so we supported just adjudication, and we believe that a full adjudication, and essentially this means that there's testimony, there's discovery, there's the opportunity to continue discussions about the revised targets in the biennial update and other components to it. And we're going to be able to have that discussion over a period of time. And then the commission will approve, reject, or approve with conditions our biennial update. So with that, I can answer any questions. All right, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt. We appreciate it. And you did not get too technical, so don't worry about that.
Okay. I can if anyone wants.
We'll save that for next time. Awesome. Thanks for the time today, Matt. And now I'd like to bring up Randy to the virtual podium to present on Integrated Resource Plan. Hi, Randy.
Hey there. Can you see and hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Okay, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. And so I'm Randy Baker, Director of Resource Planning at PacifiCorp. I oversee the Integrated Resource Planning Group, and today I'd like to give some context on what the Integrated Resource Plan, or IRP, is and how it works, covered by this set of slides, and of course, how it connects with the Clean Energy Implementation Plan. I'll spend a little bit of time on this slide to provide some orientation before moving on. And of course, I appreciate your patience if you have been in some of these meetings before and have been exposed to this already. It is updated information, and you'll probably find some new things here. So at a high level, the Integrated Resource Planning Group produces on a regular cycle a forecast for the best strategy to generate energy and meet customer needs over the next 20 years. We create this plan with a combination of research, public engagement, and mathematical models. The IRP process for long-term planning has been long established, but of course, as it turns out, the Clean Energy Implementation Plan has significant long-term planning components as well. And now the two are intertwined. Moving to the slide itself for a moment, as you can see at the left, as part of our planning process, the primary focus is our customers. When we create an integrated resource plan, customers are front and center, and this focus is actually structured directly into our models. For example, our primary method of comparing different possible plans for future energy resources, we look at portfolio resources that allow us to run our section of the power grid at least cost and least risk. And that phrase, least cost, least risk, is really core to a lot of what we do. That means least cost and least risk for our customers. You'll hear the word portfolio often as we talk about the Integrated Resource Plan or the CEIP long-term plan. A portfolio, in this sense, is a coordinated set of resources that work together to fulfill our obligations to our customers and supply safe, reliable energy. You'll also hear the term preferred portfolio. And preferred portfolio simply means that one set of coordinated resources that represents what we've determined to be the best plan for our customers out of all of those plans that were considered. In our first CEIP, we based the portfolio on our 2021 IRP. However, in our recent update to the IRP filed just 4 days ago, we integrated Washington's long-term resource planning requirements with our standard integrated resource plan to arrive at a single unified plan. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. In this illustration, we ensure that we maintain that customer focus by maximizing transparency, which includes public input meetings like this one. We'll talk more about that later. We also make our models agnostic to technologies, such as the choices between wind, solar, natural gas, lithium-ion battery storage, you name it. And what I mean by making it agnostic to technologies is we gather the best cost and performance information that we can find, and then we allow the model to determine which of those characteristics and costs lead to a least cost, least risk plan for our customers. So some of those key factors are fuel costs, operating costs, reliability, and how each resource aligns with customer needs across our system. In order to meet the goals of all of our states in our 6-state territory, we create many different kinds of portfolios to evaluate. One portfolio is for the entire Pacific Core system with no state requirements assumed. State requirements such as the Washington Clean Energy Implementation Plan. Other portfolios incorporate state-specific requirements, and still others test outcomes and assumptions looking for alternatives that might not otherwise be obvious. One of the objectives is to make sure that all the states, like Washington, are properly represented without colliding with other states' interests. And in this way, we work to represent all of our customers, but at the same time meeting all state and federal requirements. Moving to the right of this slide, I'll focus on the multi-state approach for just a moment. In order to produce a CEIP or an IRP portfolio and to arrive at a preferred portfolio for everyone, we have to adhere to all states' timing requirements and also meet certain milestones. The 2025 IRP schedule is shown later in this presentation, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But recently, on March 14th, we held our second integrated resource planning public meeting for the 2025 IRP cycle. We welcome public participation. We generally see 60 to 100 participants at each meeting. These meetings are reachable electronically, much like the meeting that we're having now. And the meetings are also recorded and available at the Pacific Core IRP website. So you can go back and see those first 2 meetings that we've already held. And the next one is coming up on May 2nd. I want to emphasize that stakeholder feedback is critical to our process. We solicit feedback and provide several means for reaching us with questions, concerns, suggestions. We incorporate feedback to aid in our representation of the IRP and the CEIP. It helps us to find errors, correct misunderstandings, take new approaches we might not have otherwise pursued, and generally improve what we would otherwise create. The last slide in this presentation provides information on how you can reach out to us outside of the public meetings. One last note on this slide, our schedule is driven by the most restrictive state requirements. So for example, for Washington, there is a 4-year cycle for producing each integrated resource plan, but other states have a 2-year cycle. And this means that Washington receives some benefits from the 2-year planning process as a result of the most demanding requirement. So, for example, in the IRP update that we just filed on April 1st, strictly speaking, it wasn't a required filing for Washington, but was provided as an informational filing to Washington. So you still get the benefits of that information. Next slide, please. So this is a quick look at Pacific Core's 6-state service territory. And you can see the areas within the states where our customers are located, shown in blue. Washington is magnified at the lower left to give you an idea where our service territory lies within the state. We serve roughly 137,000 customers in Washington out of a total of about 2 million. We do operate our system as one coordinated entity. So the reason that we do this is that a larger territory and a diversity of resources helps maintain reliability at a lower cost. If the wind isn't blowing in the west, the sun might be shining in the east. And while Washington customers are located geographically within the state, Washington shares in resources across our system. And so having this diverse portfolio of generating resources across all the states allows us to leverage geographic, climate, and resource diversity across the system and provide reliable, valuable power to our customers. Under this paradigm, and despite the lowering of targets that Matt covered a few slides back, we've already been able to bring substantial renewables onto the grid and make significant contributions to decarbonization efforts. Washington also benefits from substantial investments in energy efficiency measures, and these are the measures that we talk about quite a lot, which help our customers to use less energy in ways that reduce long-term costs and also helps remove the need for carbon-emitting resources. At the bottom right of the slide, we've included some numbers to give a sense of our Washington customer demographics. We continue to actively seek information and engagement with our customers and their communities to better serve their energy needs. So with that overview of the IRP, the PacifiCorp system, let's move to the next slide. And let me discuss just a little bit some of the ways that we provide service. Here we have some key areas of service that are core to PacifiCorp's purpose of providing that safe, reliable energy to customers. Starting from the top, the geographic diversity that I've already mentioned means that we can provide access to low-cost renewable energy where it is most productive throughout the Western United States, decarbonizing our grid and prioritizing affordability. So the next point specifically on wind, we have facilities located in the highest producing areas such as Eastern Wyoming, Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington, and Montana. And if you talk about that in terms of resource quality, we have access to some of the best wind in the country, if not the world. And Washington can share in that by being part of the larger system. Solar and energy storage facilities in the highest producing areas are found in Utah and parts of Oregon. I'll also mention here that really, while solar and energy storage are often coupled together, they are also separable, and energy storage can stand alone or it can support various other kinds of resources. But it's most common to pair energy storage with solar because specifically the storage allows a surplus of solar energy that gets generated on a regular basis to be stored and to be used when the sun isn't shining. So that's pretty straightforward, but it does have more flexibility than that. On the next item, 16,900 line miles of high voltage transmission spanning 10 states and a range of climate zones. This is what allows us to interconnect the east and west sides of our system and to allow all of our customers to share in that full diversity. And on the last point, in Washington, Pacific Power has programs that help offset the cost of electricity for customers, providing weatherization and energy efficiency services. Really, the number of different kinds of energy efficiency programs is more than I can name or remember. It's quite extensive, and we do a lot of investigation and a lot of implementation for those programs. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. Here we have a visual of the integrated resource planning development process, which occurs over a period of roughly 15 months as part of a 2-year cycle. If you've seen this presentation before or this piece of it, note that I've updated and revised this diagram for clarity. For the 2025 IRP, we kicked off our 15-month process on January 25th, 2024, at our first public input meeting. And the filing of the 2025 IRP is scheduled for March 31st of 2025, next year. The order of steps moving from left to right, I believe, is mostly intuitive, beginning with the launch shown in yellow. That's where we notify stakeholders of the schedule and the process, and we hold our first public input meeting. The next step is where we identify conservation and demand response opportunities. In other words, when we do our modeling, how much opportunity do we tell it is actually available out there for conservation measures? A very critical step that happens, we start exploring early on in the process. Then moving into months 2 and 3, we build out our analytical tools. We start talking about our modeling process, which you're going to see a little piece of a few slides further in today. In month 4, we plan for new energy and policy requirements. So anything new that's coming from the states that we operate in or from the federal government gets considered for its implications on developing our plan. Months 5 through 7, we gather and discuss inputs and assumptions. Months 8 and 9, we commit the data that we've gathered and our modeling updates so that we can actually begin turning the crank, as it were, on developing our portfolios. And so that leads into months 10 through 12, portfolio development and analytics. And that's where we test out all of the machinery that stands behind the models so that we know it's working, it's producing results that make sense. We feel we can explain anything that comes out in the results. We correct errors. It's quite an involved process as well, a very technical one. And then month 13 is where we plan to present and discuss our draft preferred portfolio. So roughly 3 months ahead of actually filing the plan, we present a draft of the plan and as much information as we can have developed by that point in time so that stakeholders can discuss it before the final filing. That's where, input into other tests that we might perform or explanations of outcomes up to that point will likely occur. And we will have some additional public meetings that happen during that time frame. And then leading up to the very end, we incorporate draft feedback. We assemble the document itself. We also assemble something called the data disk, which is a bunch of supporting materials that show, how we processed our information and gives more detail than we can actually publish in the document. And then finally, we file the report. So you may notice that these steps are not weighted evenly as different stages occupy more months than others. Some of them are simply just take longer and they're more intense, but we wanted to split it up conceptually so that you can see the progression of the steps that occur. The orange star that is between months 3 and 4 indicates where we are in the current cycle. And so we are currently standing between the setup of analytic tools and presenting modeling processes and that next step where we're planning for new energy and policy requirements. But we're only 3 to 4 months in. So, about a fifth of the way through the process. It's also good to note that these phases overlap each other. Once initiated, some phases can last through the entire rest of the cycle because we're always adjusting things, adapting to feedback, and incorporating new information where we can. One other special note on this slide, the month 8 to 9 period where we commit data and modeling updates is a critical phase in the process because roughly September is what that equates to. And we will be locking down our data and our modeling assumptions as we turn our attention to running the models creating those portfolios and evaluating the results. And we need to lock that down in September in order to make it to the draft that we file on January 1. And so what that means is that the critical work for getting feedback on our data development and the development of our planning assumptions really happens between now and September. And that's a large part of the purpose behind our integrated resource planning public input meetings. Next slide, please. So this is a description of the regulatory cycle of which the Integrated Resource Plan and the Clean Energy Implementation Plan are a part. On the left is a summary of some points of information regarding the Integrated Resource Planning process. I won't spend too much time on that, but suffice it to say that PacifiCorp has been running this long-term planning cycle for more than 20 years. We're glad to have a chance to share it with you. The graphic on the right represents the larger regulatory cycle of 2 years for the IRP. You'll notice that it's roughly 9 months longer than the 15-month cycle that I just discussed on the prior slide. In this cyclical regulatory view, steps 1, 2, and 3 of this slide really encompass those 15 months. So we initiate the public process, we develop our assumptions, modeling, and analysis, and then we file with the state commissions. But after filing the IRP document, at the end of those 15 months, there's a further regulatory process followed in steps 4 and 5. This filing plan means that we have submitted the IRP and the Clean Energy Implementation Plan for regulatory review. The rest of the 2-year cycle is then occupied with those final 2 steps where regulators and stakeholders review the plan. Depending on the state that we're in, there is different kinds of approval processes. We get feedback from regulators. And then in the off years, in the middle of each 2-year cycle, we file an IRP update between the main filings, which is mostly a check to be sure that we're still on track, that things haven't changed so much that our plan has somehow gone off the rails. And that's what we just filed on April 1, as I mentioned before. Getting a little more specific now, let's move to the next slide and look at portfolio selection. So you'll recall that a portfolio is a set of coordinated resources that work together to fulfill our obligations to our customers. Well, creating every portfolio requires 3 different integrated resource planning models in our modeling software suite. And by the way, that modeling software suite that we currently use is called Plexos. We've been using it for a few years now. It's very advanced in terms of modeling. I'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. But here you can see that there is a kind of repetitive, iterative process that happens for each portfolio that uses all 3 of those models. If you look at the orange boxes at the right, that's where the models are mentioned. And we have an LT, an MT, and an ST. That simply stands for long-term, medium-term, and short-term models. And so when we develop a portfolio, we begin by running the long-term model, and that model is a capacity expansion model that develops a resource plan. It is the one that actually picks the resources themselves and says, these are your best options for a particular set of assumptions. Then we move to a reliability step, again, moving down those steps on the right in orange. And then that reliability step, the MT or medium-term model, is used to allocate things like fuel usage across each year of the model. It also produces stochastics and volatility information that's needed by the final model, the short-term model. And what that means is we plug in a bunch of data. That data may or may not be right. One of the things that we do to account for our own error is we introduce stochastic variation, which is a statistically determined variance to our inputs that allows for the fact that we don't know exactly what's going to happen. And those stochastics are built out over a very technical process to make sure that the variation we introduce makes sense. Does it match variations we've seen historically? Does it represent all kinds of conditions that may actually occur in the system? So that's a very important step so that we don't just assume that, for example, we know how strong the wind's going to be blowing in Washington on a certain day 15 years from now, which would be an absurd assumption to rest easy with. And so that's a key factor in the cost and risk analysis that both the MT and the ST models help us to produce. The ST model is our most granular model. It runs 20 years of hourly information and really shows us how that portfolio of resources can operate over time at a very detailed level, and allows us to analyze things pretty much in any way that you want. And so as you're moving down the process on the left, we run different sets of circumstances, different possible futures, different conditions, different assumptions through those models. We develop candidate portfolios. We determine which of them are the best performing, in other words, which are the least cost and have the least risk. That leads to the selection of the preferred portfolio, that one best plan, and that one best plan gets represented in our action plan in the IRP document itself. And so if you're interested, you can go online, find the 2023 Integrated Resource Plan. You can go to Chapter 10, and it presents the near-term actions that we plan to take on the basis of that plan. We've updated it in the recent 2023 IRP update, as I said. So that would give you a more current view, excuse me, of what we're actually pursuing. Moving to the next slide. This is a discussion of the portfolio development process. I won't spend too much time here, but I wanted to give an idea of how these LT, MT, and ST models work through and iterate. We don't just run the model once and say, that's good enough, we're done. What we do is, in step one, we create that initial expansion plan. As I just talked about, we use the MT-ST models to produce an hourly dispatch and to do risk metrics. In step three, we report the ST model hourly shortfalls according to our topology. What does that mean? It means that we've got areas across our 6 states grouped into what we call bubbles. And each of those has a certain amount of energy it needs. The portfolios that we've created might supply too much, or they might supply too little. We are particularly looking for shortfalls or deficiencies. We then calculate, based on this, an adjustment that takes into account those deficiencies so that when we run the LT model on the next time around, it has new and more detailed information about where we need resources, where, when, and what kind. And we do this until we don't have shortfalls anymore. And sometimes it can take 3, 5, 8 cycles to reach a point where we really feel that we've got the best plan. Moving to the next slide, please.